Brian, and we do have time, not as much as I thought, but we have time, so I invite Susan and Richard back up to kind of engage in a little discussion and in response to questions. There is a mic standing there in the middle of the room. If someone has a question they'd like to walk up, they're welcome to do that. And we have a floating mic here. You guys can hold that. Okay. So let me open up with a question. To me, one common underlying thing in all of your talks is data. You know, Richard and Susan, you talked about it, and Susan, you made the point about which data is open, and it seems more and more data is becoming open. And Brian, of course, City of San Francisco, you have many, probably more data sets than you could count, you know, and most of those are freely available and open, which is kind of a great resource for researchers, certainly thinking of questions. But I'm thinking about what thoughts you have on the coherence of that data, or how do we catalog, how do we know that the data exists? How do we kind of organize it, make it useful for folks? And anyway, I just welcome the thoughts that I imagine each of your kind of groups have been thinking about that.
Yeah, is this on?
Yeah.
It is on, okay. Yeah, no, in some ways we have too much data, and in other ways we have way too little data. I mean, we're oozing with data on certain things that are coming in, and we don't necessarily know how to maintain that data or process that data in a way that's really helpful. And then in other situations we have data that will answer sort of like 7, maybe we have 10 things we want to solve, and the data will answer like 4 or 5 of them, and then for another part they'll answer, you know, a portion of the data. And the data is coming again from so many different sources that if we're not, we don't really have an effective way, I think, to sort of harness it. We have pushed this data SF platform quite a bit, and we found that to be extremely useful in that now that whenever a department collects data, they have to put it up on, they have to, it's part of our city code, make it available to the public, and that's allowed the public sort of come back and take that data and actually enhance it and improve it. What we're struggling with is how do we maintain it? Mm-hmm. And that's, you know, I have a person in our office who's sort of dedicated to doing this, but even with him, our data for this hazard and climate resilience plan came from, I think, 15 different departments. Some of it's 30 years old, some of it's 2 years old, some of it's a month old. How do we sort of put it all together?
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of the big challenges, particularly for geodetic data, the SAR data. It's something that's come up a lot in discussions about within the community. Just within the science community and the people who are working on these different missions, there's a move towards putting the data in the cloud. For synthetic aperture radar, we're talking about very large volumes of data. I didn't bring it up in my talk, but that's one of the other challenges with working with that data. So there's investments from NASA and as well as from NSF in trying to build the technology to enable us to work with that data. But I think one of the things that I see from like the example from the Norway Geological Survey is that where within our community we tend to get stuck at the kind of the science level data that doesn't really get to the information that people outside the research community can use. They were able to get the funding and push through to a data set that is understandable and usable by more and more people, or a broader range of people. And that's something that we're trying to advocate for more and more, is that we figure out what those key data sets are and make sure that those are easily available and curated and well advertised to the community. Another thing that we found talking to FEMA is that they have this challenge of they get all this different types of data. And so the same thing we've had is we had all this different kind of research grade data. It's difficult for somebody to come in and see that plethora of data, that variety of data, and understand how to make sense of it. And so we really need, as a community, to make sure that we're distilling it into something that is kind of like the MyShake app. I mean, something that is usable and by the citizen scientist, by the non-expert. I give the MyShake group a lot of kudos for that, in that it is a very usable app. Shake Alert LA, not very good. I downloaded that one because I'm in LA. Much happier with MyShake. I do have that. But it is, earthquake early warning is an example of how, if they just kept it at the research level, it really wouldn't reach out to the community. It really wouldn't serve its purpose. So it is going to be a challenge. I think it is something that, within the academic community, within the research community, we need to make sure that we're training people who have the right tools to deal with that massive amount of data.
Thank you for the endorsement, first of all. But I just have two comments on the data piece. The first is the MyShake data. I was inviting people to kind of think about how to make use of that, the seismic data that the phones are collecting. But of course, we have a unique challenge with that data, and that's privacy issues, because this is data coming from personal, private phones. And we are still trying to work out how we do that. What we cannot do is simply make the entire data set openly available like we do with the traditional seismic network data. So, as most of you know, obviously in Northern California, the seismic data set is all of the Northern California Earthquake Data Center. It's openly available to anybody. We can't just put the entire MyShake data set there openly available, because that would violate the privacy rules that we were advised we need to put in place if people were going to download the app. So we're trying to figure out the right medium here. So while we can't put all of the data there, my hope, my goal is that once we get to events, significant events, we can have those specific curated data sets, for example, be made available. So that's another element to the kind of data challenge, is as we have these sort of pervasive sensor networks, there are other privacy type issues. And then the other comment I'll make quickly is that with the massive increase of data that we're all talking about, the other challenge is now putting the computational capability right next to the data capability, or the data storage. And we've all been talking about this for many years, but we don't think we've been making much progress. So we're trying to make this a very small incremental change, but we're actually putting computational capability at the Northern California Earthquake Data Center, which is housed here in Berkeley, to try and it's really modest, so please nobody get too excited. But we're trying to kind of start on that path to kind of put computational capabilities right next to the data set, and then invite anybody in the research community to come and use them to really take advantage of these big data analysis techniques.
Yeah, Charlie.
Hello.
There you
We can hear you, Charlie, so we can repeat.
Okay, so first of all, thank all the speakers. So this is a question, and actually more of a sharing of concern with Ryan, but partially a question for you. A few weeks ago, I was on a panel with someone from New Zealand who reviewed the Christchurch recovery. And of course, the Christchurch downtown area, as many people know, was cordoned off for many months. And you addressed it a little bit in your presentation about the cordoning off area. I talked to that person and said, did you learn anything from that? If you have to do over again, would you handle the cordoning off differently? Because the whole downtown area was cordoned off. And he basically said, no, I think we do it about the same. Which stunned me, because that was their decision. So I know you're not the emergency manager of the city of San Francisco, but can you comment more on the potential impacts of cordoning off the whole downtown San Francisco area, which is certainly within the realm of possibility?
Yeah, sure, Charlie. Now, and I know in Christchurch they were actually having issues with their downtown. This sort of gets into this idea of a stressor. They were having challenges with their downtown before the earthquake. So in some ways, I think a lot of people felt like it was an opportunity to redesign it completely. However, they still haven't regained their population and their tax base as a result of that. Yeah, this is a big thing that came out of our tall building study, was not only thinking about coordinating, but thinking about how we have to have a better downtown recovery plan. If we shut down even shutting down 4 blocks of downtown is going to have a big impact on the city's tax base and the federal tax base, which also happens in New Zealand. And, we see this as a control issue as well. If we're not addressing it, then actually the federal government, FEMA, and other folks are going to come in. There are a lot of federal tax dollars that are generated by downtown San Francisco. So we're actually working right now to create a recovery framework to think about these issues in advance. I think that's something that parts of New Zealand and Wellington have actually developed quite a bit. They're ahead of us on. And then we're also thinking about how we establish some type of a downtown recovery plan to think about those specific issues. It gets down to where are the priority streets and priority routes in downtown, and how do we make sure that the buildings on those routes either are better constructed, maybe there's a higher performance standard, or maybe we're thinking about other ways to mitigate expected damage that will happen there. So some of it's modeling, but I think the other part of it is looking at policies. Right now, there's not a policy for coordinating, so it's really going to be the building inspector and maybe the fire department kind of trying to figure out what seems reasonable, and that's not going to work. I don't think that's going to be acceptable.
So, Brian, we're just about at time, but let me ask you one question. Of the talks that you heard here, and thinking of recovery plan and what San Francisco's doing, use your imagination. How can what you just heard from Richard, of course, the earthquake early warning is a little bit more direct, so you can't say that one. We already know the answer there. But in terms of, thinking more broadly instead of the immediate, warning that an earthquake's coming, but the recovery process, how could these sort of technologies, do you have any thoughts on how they can help the city in the recovery process, either planning ahead of time or as you go through that recovery?
Yeah, no, I definitely think planning, immediately just planning ahead of time, really, especially with a lot of what Susan was talking about, thinking about where the risks are. We know, the science on sea level rise, I think, is still trying to catch up with some of the science around some of the earthquakes that are happening. But we know we're going to have to start drawing lines where areas of San Francisco are going to flood, or where areas of San Francisco are going to have severe earthquakes or landslides, and we need to start making some land use decisions around it. So it may be that certain portions of the city, we're going to have to do some type of what's sort of termed as managed retreat by the, state. Yeah, anyway, so whether it's managed retreat, or whether it's areas like they've done in parts of Germany, Hamburg, and so forth, where it can just flood. And we're going to have to make some of those decisions. And I think using some of that radar technology to think in advance and understand and to do some of the modeling, it is exciting to me, and it's an opportunity to push that conversation. The more we can get that out there, we can talk about that sooner, the better. Doesn't mean it's going to be an easy conversation, but that would be helpful. And then, early earthquake warning, we were talking about, other countries have had it for a lot longer than we have, so it's been a struggle to get people to do it. And even in San Francisco today, I still have people saying, well, we're only going to get 5 seconds of warning. Is it worth it? Is it just going to create confusion? And I was just saying, Richard, I need you to come talk to some of these people, even today, to say, yeah, 5 seconds is still worth it, and there's still some benefit, but or it could be 25 seconds. So we still need to, I think, continue to make the case.
Mm-hmm. So. Okay. All right, well, since we're getting hungry, so I'd like to close this, but really thank our kind of 3 speakers here today. I really learned a lot and found it was fascinating. I hope you did, and I hope it really kind of spurred folks' imagination for kind of these sort of technologies and thinking to ourselves how we could use them in our research for the betterment of planning and so forth for earthquake and other hazard mitigation. So I'd like to, again, thank our speakers and thank all of you in the audience.